Yeah, that's it. Yeah, Marriott. Yeah.
Yeah, so we got Mr. Thomas on here. Thomas, why don't you go ahead and give us your intro to herps and everything else, man?
Yeah, sure. Okay. Yeah, so I'm the editor of Exotics Keeper magazine, which is like a UK publication, but obviously it's available digitally and sort of internationally. So yeah, I've been doing that for about 4 years now, and yeah, I've been interested in reptiles all my life. Started off my sort of keeping with a leopard gecko when I was about 10 years old. And sort of over that time, also done a fair bit of traveling as well, which has been really nice. So spent last year, spent 6 months in South America. This year, 6 months sort of around Asia. And also New Caledonia, which was awesome. And yeah, and a few other places over the years as well, Madagascar, things like that. So it's a perfect combination here with obviously the flexibility of being a magazine sort of manager and editor, but also being able to travel. And that obviously all ties in together to be able to bring some interesting sort of unique stories to the magazine, to the platform. And more recently, sort of doing bits with film and Instagram reels and stuff like that. It's all kind of new to me, the social side of things. So it's great to see some really good responses to the things we've been doing along the way. Yeah, that's me.
We've had some experience. I'd like to think you're making some, nice traction, and with the social media stuff. So was New Caledonia your latest trip, or have you been somewhere else since you've been in New Caledonia?
Yeah, so the last trip was quite a few months long. Like started off in Australia, another herping sort of expedition there in Western Australia for a month. And then moved through sort of Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia and Borneo, and then over to New Caledonia before doing sort of Japan, India, Sri Lanka. So quite a few countries on the way, but yeah, not all of it was obviously dedicated to herps, but there's always a lot of herping going on along the way. So yeah, the New Caledonia stretch was probably the most sort of significant from a sort of herpetological perspective. That was a expedition that was solely for work, really. I'm not complaining about it, but we were there with a focus of finding them geckos, getting them habitat shots, writing up a nice article. We got some environmental data and things like that, and just sort of sharing a part of the world that I guess a lot of people don't get to see very often. And obviously seeing crested geckos in the wild was just absolutely insane. So yeah, it was part of the most recent trip, but not the most recent destination.
All right. So if you don't mind, I guess I'd like to start off talking about that. Then we'll talk about your New Caledonia experiences, and then we'll, obviously feather off into some of these other amazing things that you've done in places you've been. First and foremost, one of my most dying questions to ask, I guess, is how exactly did you just get into New Caledonia? A lot of the other guys that have been there and, stories we'll hear in the hobby is that you can't just show up in New Caledonia. You need some type of permission, or maybe, permission from a tribal chief or something like that. People say that it's pretty hard to get there and just cruise around and chuck stuff out. How exactly did you go about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's to be fair, it's really not that difficult. It's they've got there's an international airport there. It's kind of hard to get there. There's not that many flights going really, so you can go. I think there is a direct flight through Paris. You can go via Singapore, Brisbane, New Zealand, and Japan. So there's, but even that's maybe one flight from each destination a week. So yeah, you get a few flights a day, but it's a bit out of the way. But yeah, you can go as a tourist, no problem. I don't think we even needed visas as like a British citizen, so it was quite nice. I think some of the, obviously while we were there, we were making sure that we weren't doing anything too invasive. We were obviously taking habitat shots and things like that. So yeah, obviously you need to understand a little bit about obviously the geckos themselves and the habitats that they occupy. And I've quite a good working relationship with Philip de Boschede. So I asked him for some advice on where he was finding the geckos, and that was really nice because Isle of Pines is really the only place in New Caledonia where you have any any sort of high chances of finding these geckos. And actually it proved to be quite straightforward. We found one on day one, really, the first full day of being there. So, but again, you know, people aren't looking for them. The people on Isle of Pines, they knew a little bit about the leeches. Like I'd been asking around and just trying to get an idea for what people think of the geckos out there. They knew about the leeches because there's an island just off the Isle of Pines, I think it's Bros, where they're quite common, and so people go there and they want to see them. But yeah, most of them had no idea really what a crested gecko was, which was crazy. You know, like in the hobby, it's such like an iconic species. So getting there is quite straightforward to go as a tourist, but yeah, finding crested geckos is the tough bit, really. But as long as you're sort of on the Isle of Pines and you're looking in the right kind of habitat, you can find them. So yeah, it's one of them destinations that's so far away from everything because it's super remote, but actually the sort of bureaucracy of getting there isn't that difficult. Obviously, going out herping, some of the locations, for example, one of the forests where some of the first geckos came from is all sort of like tribal land, and obviously I don't even speak French, so it would have been really difficult to actually approach some local people and ask for permission to go on that land. But you know, if you're looking in the right habitat in the forest and the trails and stuff that anyone can access, then they're still there. So yeah.
Nice. So how much of the Isle of Pines, I know that it's a smaller place in comparison to others, but how big is the Isle of Pines, maybe in miles or kilometer wise, and how much of the island did you actually explore?
Yeah, I mean, Isle of Pines is tiny. Distance wise, it's hard to say, but I mean, you could drive across it in 20 minutes from the top to the bottom. Yeah, it's a really small island. And even like infrastructure wise, there's 2 main hotels and maybe 2 or 3 campsites on there, because most people that go there, but they're usually, you know, tourists will holiday in New Caledonia and then do maybe a day trip to the Isle of Pines or stay in like a fancy hotel for a night and then go back again. So it's really not that developed, which is lovely, really, because any sort of disturbances on the Isle of Pines could be quite detrimental to the geckos there. Obviously, it's a small area, it's small populations anyway, but the actual habitat there, like the sort of forest where the crested geckos are, is quite limited as well. Like the center of the Isle of Pines is like pine forest and sort of it's not even scrub, it's like really like low level forest and obviously pines, and that's not really where you find the geckos. So it's nice that it's still a very remote island. It's, yeah, as I say, absolutely tiny. And I think, I mean, we went in the wet season, so obviously there's not that many tourists there anyway. But it's a really small place. And then all the little islets off of Isle of Pines also have different species as well. So I think there's Trachyrhynchus on one of them. There's, you know, different morphs of leeches, I'm sure, but we couldn't get out there because it was rainy season. Obviously, trying to find someone with a boat to take you out to some of the really remote areas is difficult. And there's no crested geckos on those smaller islets as far as I'm aware. So yeah, most of it was on Isle of Pines, but even there, as I say, 20 minutes to cross the entire island. At one point, we moved hotel to try and find some other habitat, and ended up not getting a lot of luck. So hiring a car and just whizzing back to the first location. And it was, yeah, super easy, really small place, and yeah, beautiful place as well. Really, really nice.
Yeah, the videos you posted, I mean, some of the pictures and stuff, I mean, it's literally like, looks like a paradise, you know, it's a gorgeous, gorgeous place.
Yeah, I mean, get the weather right and it's incredible. And, you know, it would be really nice to sort of go back there when it's dry season. But yeah, it's crystal clear waters, and also a lot of sea snakes as well, which is first place really where it's like an abundance of sea snakes, which was really nice. Every time you go out snorkeling, you'd come across they have a unique species, like an endemic species of sea crate. I think the New Caledonian sea crate. They have the turtle-headed sea snake. They have like the banded sea crate. Yeah. heaps of species, which is really nice. But then obviously actual land dwelling snakes, I don't think there's any on New Caledonia or any of the nearby islands.
So how many through your, I know you went there predominantly looking for crested geckos, but out of all the New Caledonian species, how many did you actually encounter? Did you find gargoyles? Did you find any chahuas or?
No, I mean, we were focusing primarily on cresties. So the sort of search location when you're walking through the forest, you have some of the Urodactylodes you can find on the lower levels, sort of on the Schefflera sort of plants and things like that. And there's St. Patrick with the cresties. But then the chahua, the cresties are sort of 10 to 15 foot maybe up in the canopy, so in the sort of understory. And you can see them moving around, and they're quite, well, not easy to locate, but you can see their white bellies with a flashlight quite easily. Whereas the chahua and the leeches are much higher up. So they'll be against bark, and obviously it was just myself and my girlfriend that went on this expedition. So it's not like some of the big expeditions that have been done in the past, where you've got a whole research team out there for a long time. So we really focused on those cresties. So we found a bunch of bavaya, but we didn't find, the iconic sort of chahuas and leeches and things like that. We just focused entirely on the cresties, but we are hoping, or it would be nice if we could get back out there next year and then hopefully diversify some of that content. Any of the gaps that we sort of had this time, really patch them up and spend a bit more time looking for them, because it was quite heartbreaking coming away from New Caledonia having not seen a leechie. But it's just the way it is,
Yeah. So how does the true environment of those cresties, how does that compare to like most of the hobbies, their setups? Are they getting it close, or are they a little off on that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, like environmentally, it was quite interesting to see that we're doing really quite well in the hobby. So the actual, we're taking obviously UV readings and temperature and humidity, and it's obviously for that part of the year during monsoon season, it was sort of end of March, start of April, which is like in the full swing of cyclone season. The temperatures really didn't change that much. So they sort of fluctuated between early morning, you're looking at about 23 degrees. It might go up to about 26, 27. But rarely, even into the evening, you were looking at, 90% humidity and not massive temperature drops or anything like that. So it's nice to know that sort of, and there's an element of like staticness with the conditions that we keep, cresties in at home. And I think that it's, tried and tested. Like it's kind of that was encouraging, because I did expect there to be a bit more fluctuation with temperatures and humidity at least. But that was good to see. But in terms of setups, I think across the hobby with all species, I think people obviously like to build a setup that looks really nice. They have this idea of like a tropical rainforest, and it's that sort of Amazon, bromeliads and ferns and everything everywhere, and it's all they look fantastic. But actually the habitat that you find crested geckos in is a lot more sparse. So they're really thin sort of branches, really thin, even like the tree trunks are small. There's a list in the article that we published with EK of different sort of species and flora and things like that. But obviously there's photos for anyone that's listening to this, photos on socials, and we'll be releasing some of them videos on YouTube eventually as well, of the habitat. But it's really not a pretty environment really, because on Grand Touré, there's a few higher elevation national parks that are stunning. You get that perfect, like picturesque, what I think people are trying to do with their cresty enclosures, where you've got huge ferns and, water features and lovely mossy branches and all that kind of thing. But actually on the Isle of Pines, where those first crested geckos came from, it's sort of like a coastal dry forest in a way. Considering it didn't stop raining, it almost looks like you've not got all them like epiphytes, albeit there is quite a few tree ferns, but it's look like a single species, but you've not got heaps of different plants growing on top of each other, and these sort of beautiful you know, yeah, how people build their terrariums, you know. So that was quite interesting. And even like the layers where you find these crested geckos, like in an evening, they're moving across almost like horizontal thin branches, which I think most people tend to have, like, you know, some really nice cork barks and branches and stuff that fills up a 3-dimensional space. But actually we were finding them, yeah, almost exactly horizontal. That's obviously partly because that's where we would be spotting them, walking underneath them with a torch. You end up finding, you know, that's, you see their white bellies and stuff. So there was obviously an element of bias towards that, but it does seem like they move through the forest in these, yeah, almost like horizontally. And I wonder how many people actually apply sort of horizontal branches into their enclosure, because it just looks a bit clunky and it sort of fills things out. You know, it's not as aesthetically pleasing, but it's interesting to see that that's where they are, you know?
Absolutely. So one of the more controversial topics in the hobby with the crested geckos is, well, in my opinion, UVB. So since you've been there and your experiences with the jungle and the forest floor where the lower levels where the cresties are and UVB would either not penetrate, how do you feel? Do you feel that they're getting UVB? Do you feel that in the wild in New Caledonia on the Isle of Pines that they're being exposed to any significant amount of UV light in general?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because on the one hand, we found crested geckos not active but exposed during the day. So like on the side of tree trunks and things like that, fully exposed. And, you know, yeah, middle of the day, 3 o'clock in the afternoon at one point, you know. And so these geckos are not hiding away in little crevices, avoiding all sunlight and that kind of thing. So they are definitely exposed to a level of UV. On the other hand, we rarely recorded anything above 0.5 UVI in that habitat. So you could go out to the beach and you'd be stood there and, you know, when it was clear, maybe 11 UVI, like really strong, but actually in the forest, there's really not that much UV sort of penetrating that layer, albeit if the geckos are exposed to that extent, they obviously have some kind of, well, they must be finely tuned to the day and night cycles at the very least. So I would always lean towards the side of providing UV. But again, like, interesting that it should be in very small quantities as well. But this sort of overarching rule of, like, you know, nocturnal species can get away with not so much UV, well, that doesn't really apply to crested geckos because they're exposed during the day. So if there's an argument to provide a low level of UV rather than try and perfectly simulate the sunlight in New Caledonia, then absolutely, I think it's right to be sort of reserved with how much we're providing. But yeah, they don't seem to have an aversion to sunlight, so I can't see an argument to not provide UV.
Awesome. Awesome.
Got a question in the chat. So what were the insects that were found over there in the crested gecko habitat, and what were those sizes, and like what kind of insects were there that you noticed that they might have been like eating on?
Yeah, I guess a lot of it was moths and things like that, and flies, usually because we're going out looking for them at night and they're attracted to lights as well. Also lots of small crickets. Surprisingly, not that many spiders, where, you know, you usually walk through the tropics in other places around the world, you find spiders absolutely everywhere. We didn't really come across that many. There was also enormous katydids, so obviously they wouldn't be feeding on anything that size, but that was quite interesting to see. So yeah, crickets were quite abundant. They'd be sitting on the edge of leaves and stuff, relatively static. So yes, sort of kind of arboreal. There's also loads of snails there as well. So snails are obviously, they eat like escargot over there, and it's like quite popular. But on the Isle of Pines, there's snails absolutely everywhere, and they're enormous snails as well. Like they're huge. You're constantly trying to avoid stepping on them. But I do wonder whether there's perhaps that makes some component to crested gecko diets. You know, the babies, you see them up in the trees. So obviously we weren't at the same level, sort of layer in the forest where the crested geckos were to really do an analysis of the insects that are there. But if you're finding baby snails sort of, well up to sort of head height, then you can only assume that there's going to be more sort of young snails up there, and they probably come down and become more terrestrial as they grow, because there's a lot of adults on the floor. But these I would like to know how much sort of snails make up a crested gecko's diet, because obviously they're packed with calcium. There's a lot of breeders that work with other gecko species that absolutely swear by snails, almost essential for breeding, because it is just a great way of getting that calcium in there. And I guess crested geckos, they're also like reasonably large bodied, and the temperatures out there are not particularly hot, so I guess they must be somewhat methodical with their movements, and probably predating on or the insect components being quite good. Do you know what I mean? Quite fatty, quite full of calcium and that kind of thing. So it's difficult to say without a proper sort of gut analysis, and we weren't doing that over there. We didn't want to do anything too invasive, as I said. But it was interesting to see a lot of snails, and I'd like to see how sort of hobbyists do with maybe trying a few snails. And crickets and things like that as well, they were really common. Didn't see many sort of grubs and caterpillars and stuff like that. It might have been something to do with the time of year. It's really hard to say, but definitely snails everywhere.
I have my about them myself. I use them as feeders for a lot of my chihuahuas. Chihuahuas, if you know anything about them, at least in captivity, they're notorious for having calcium crashes, after laying eggs and breeding and whatnot. And I did a bit of studying myself on the islands, and had stumbled across that myself, how prevalent the snails were. So it dawned on me, like you said, with all these other guys that use them for Ebenalis and Madagascar species, why would they not be? Smaller, younger snails are apt to be in the canopy where these other things are eating dead vegetation. Why would it not? Why would a chihuahua not eat them? That's a significant calcium, in my opinion. And it's cool to hear you say that. It's interesting.
Absolutely, it's nice to hear other people doing it, because it's something that the penny's just dropped. Do you know what I mean? If they're that abundant there, and that they're an important part in other gecko diets, just makes sense.
Did you find any ghost crabs? Did you see any crabs, land crabs?
Yes, there was heaps of crabs, all over the place. I mean, as I say, it was like sort of coastal forest where we were looking. So on the ground, I imagine it was like limestone and dead coral and that kind of thing. And
very high in calcium, limestone.
Exactly, yeah. So then even the plants are absorbing that kind of thing, and it could easily be passed on through the environment. And a lot of crabs just moving around through all those sort of crevices. And I don't know exactly which was ghost crabs or whatever, but there's a bunch of hermit crabs, a bunch of really big crabs all over the place.
That's awesome. That's very cool.
So did you while you were there, did you see any like partially eating fruit that was on the ground anywhere near the habitats? If so, like what kind did you see?
I mean, I think we'd have had to been very lucky to find like a gecko eating there and then. So, but we were looking obviously at the different fruits as well. So the expedition itself was funded by Blue River Diets, which is a brand of gecko foods that's been launched in the UK and is, I think, coming to the US very soon, if not already there. A big part of it was obviously trying to understand the flora out there, get a bit of inspiration for new product development, and obviously just do that research there and then, and get as good an understanding of the wild environments as possible. But a lot of the fruits. In fact, the first time that we found a crested gecko, I was walking down this trail, and there was actually some green-bellied tree skinks there, sort of gathering around this tree. And obviously this tree I think they were probably predating on some bugs that were being brought in, because there was a lot of like flies and stuff buzzing around. And actually this tree was producing berries that had turned to mush and just basically fallen down. It kind of looked just like almost like an orange powder by the time they'd sort of hit the lower levels. And I was like, this just seems like the perfect place, because there was like a sudden abundance of life and reptiles hunting insects and insects being brought in by this fruit. And then it was a few meters away, actually, on an adjacent tree that we found the first one. And there's definitely, well, there's obviously fruit out there that's like becoming overripe, but it's not necessarily hitting the ground and decaying on the ground or anything like that. In fact, it's more like small fruits that have gone overripe, fallen, and perhaps just turned into mush on the trees. So I'd imagine these geckos are actually just lapping up very small amounts of like very rich fruit as they move through the canopy, rather than, like, we didn't see any fruits that were a substantial size or anything that looked like anything that we sort of eat as people, It was all very small stuff, small berries, a few sort of tropical palm fruits. I don't know, maybe people eat that, but it was nothing like familiar, like big mangoes or anything like that, so the fruit side of things is kind of different. In Madagascar, for example, if you left a bowl of fruit out within an hour, a couple of hours, you'd have Phelsuma come down and they're on it. Do you know what I mean? They're swarming those things. It's just not like that with Cresties. Like, they will be moving. They don't really cross anthropogenically altered habitats. They don't really swarm into, gardens and stuff. They're not brought into areas with fruit or, growing there. But it will be, as I said, like when the berries become ripe, or small fruits that have fallen from the top of the trees and the canopy, and then potentially, just get stuck in branches, get caught up perhaps in ferns as well. There's a lot of tree ferns. I know Emmanuel from Exoterra was apparently finding crested geckos curled up in these tree ferns and things like that. So that would be catching a lot of stuff. So, like Europlatus, they will sit where spider webs have caught leaf litter. They'll move towards that and use that for like camouflage. And there's a bit of synergy there. And I think the fruits in New Caledonia are not necessarily like one big fruit, but actually just turning into mush that just gets caught up all over the trees, really.
So if you, I don't know how to ask this, but what type of behaviors did you observe? Did you observe crested geckos in just, I don't know, doing anything, climbing, maybe, I guess not eating, but what natural behaviors did you observe these crested geckos doing? What did you take in from watching them?
It's hard to say, really, because obviously, like, we'd just try and take the opportunity and trying to get as many photographs as possible. They're surprisingly similar natured to the ones in captivity. They weren't that flighty. They weren't particularly running away. They were moving sort of relatively slowly. At any point you disturb them, typically they would go straight upwards, which was quite interesting. They'd be right at the end of these branches in the understory, and then suddenly it's like, right, turn back round and just go as far up as possible, which I know they've sort of filled that ecological niche because they are predated on by the leeches that are much higher up. So obviously you're a disturbance coming from below, so they would probably move away from it. But instead of moving between different trees or trying to find like a little bolt hole or little tree hollow, a bit of bark to hide under, it's their immediate response is just go up, which was quite interesting to see. Obviously the observation of one out in the middle of the day was really cool. It really like fired down, like it had gone really, really dark during the day and just sat against the side of this tree trunk, which was actually really quite light bark as well. It stood out it made no sense how that gecko, we thought that it was inconspicuous just against this tree and like super dark. But yeah, that was interesting. I think like from a morphological perspective, their colors must change in the wild as well, which, you know, we know about in captivity, but it's interesting to see in the wild. Yeah, and population densities as well. You know, they're not, I think we found 4 over the course of like a solid week of looking. We spent longer in New Caledonia, but actually the full week of going out every single night and looking for them. Typically, if we found one, we would call it a night, because you'd be looking for a solid few hours at a time and then getting back and obviously keeping up with work at the same time. You know, it wasn't this proper survey situation. So talking about population densities is could be problematic, but yeah, there's not loads of them. They're really not. They really are unique, and obviously, as I was saying, with the local people not even knowing they're there, they're really quite inconspicuous geckos. And yeah, just surprising, really. And not surprising, actually. They're the perfect candidate for a pet lizard. They are incredibly well-natured. They're lovely. They obviously breed very well. They're adorable. Even the wild ones look a little bit battered and bruised, and they certainly do look a bit different to the captive populations. But they, I can see why they have become so popular. But the chances of it ever happening, you know, this tiny little remote population of geckos elsewhere, and it would be really interesting to learn more about their distribution on Gran Terre. I think there's 2 populations on Gran Terre, as far as I'm aware. There might have been more that have been identified, but it's not a very well explored island anyway. And you know, even all the little islets off of the Isle of Pines having unique species there, and this, yeah, it's like a treasure trove of discovery out there. It's really, really cool.
It's super interesting.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
with your observations out there and obviously seeing in captivity, how do they, I'm sure we all know this, but how drastically do they differ from a wild specimen versus your captive fed everyday species? What can you say in comparison to a captive specimen versus a wild specimen? Color, structure wise.
Yeah, I think there's a when you look at female individuals, for example, the females we were finding out there, really slender, really, I mean, both males and females, I think in captivity, the heads are much broader. They've been bred to sort of, you know, they look, I think there's certain traits that people like about crested geckos, and those have been bred, and they look healthy. I imagine the first few generations of crested geckos being bred, you go for the animals that are more robust. And obviously over time, we've got really robust captive individuals, and you see the wild ones and you think, well, they're so skinny, you know, but then we found a few male specimens, and actually the males look very much like the captive populations, but the females are, I feel like there's probably more sexual dimorphism within the wild populations, because yeah, it's easy to actually just identify and sex wild ones. The females are a lot more slender, a lot more sort of like a pointed head structure kind of thing, but more angular, whereas the males is still a bit bulkier. The coloration wise, again, we had a small sample, but the males were typically like a bit lighter and almost had like a bit of an olive tinge to them, which is something that, you know, I'm not a gecko breeder myself, so I don't know whether that's a trait that's, you know, in the hobby, but actually I've not seen any morphs that have this kind of like olive hues. That's not something that seems to have been celebrated. I think people breed for the, you know, patterns and more sort of contrasted stuff. So I didn't see any of that. In fact, there's meant to be some populations in Isle of Pines that have little black spots on their flank and things like that. The ones we found, I think, was a brand new population, or I know I couldn't find any records of anyone finding those geckos there. I think on iNaturalist, the observations are all being blurred out anyway, so it's really difficult to tell who's finding what where and where things have been photographed. But yeah, the geckos we found didn't have the black spots. And then, yeah, they didn't have really any patterns. There was no trace of, you know, interesting patterns and spots and stuff that could potentially become a new morph further down the line. It wasn't, yeah, it was, they were a lot more drab, yeah, sort of dark browns. And for some reason, it could have just been the individuals we found, but these males were, yeah, a little bit olive.
Well, fitting for their environment.
Yeah, it seems like that's their wild type colors right there.
Mm.
Like that buckskin, whatever they used to call them, right?
Yeah,
that's what they call them, a buckskin. Yeah.
You know, I don't know. I personally don't even know myself where or how or what. You know, I just read and heard little tidbits over the years of, you know, certain traits that are found in the wild. But, you know, you hear all, Rinpoche, Ala Rinpoche would say, you know, they found some with a red spot on their side. You know, they would be pretty much tan or olivish with a red spot, and, you know, little bits over the years. But I was just curious as to, you know, maybe if, you know, any particular trait was, you know, directly linked to, you know, a wild specimen, I guess. But,
Yeah.
They may differ by region, you know, God only knows, you know, and I'd imagine an animal that lives in a drier environment would naturally evolve to be a drier color, if you will, versus one that lives in a higher altitude on the mainland with more green and more, I don't know, you know.
Yeah, I mean the population on around Blue River Provincial Park on Gran Terre compared to the population on Isle of Pines, they are so far away from one another. Like, they're completely distinct populations. I'm sure there's been enough work. I'm sure Aaron Barrett at some point has you know, done the genetic analysis and things, and it's all been debunked. But it would be really interesting to see what those differences are, and really put you know, photograph a good sample of geckos for both populations and see what those differences are. Because, yeah, it's not even just the ocean that separates them. It's the whole, sort of exterior of Gran Terre. That's the Blue River Provincial Park is relatively high altitude and in the center of this island. And then, yeah, surrounded by dry coastal habitats. Like, there must be some differences there, you know, but it's just these populations are so small, and trying to get any data on the Gran Terre localities of crested geckos, yeah, really difficult, very difficult.
Very interesting.
Yeah. So I got a question in the chat. Said, what's the main differences in crested gecko and gargoyle habitats in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, very different actually. There's some. I guess gargoyle geckos are a little bit more versatile with their habitat use, so you can find them across most of Gran Terre, and I think I read somewhere that they're actually the most widely distributed of those sort of diplodactylid geckos on New Caledonia is the gargoyles. And, you know, their habitat, yeah, they've got a bunch of different habitats, and some of it I'm sure is actually more similar to the crested geckos. But the main areas where research is done and where all the observations are is actually scrubland. So they tend to live in this sort of scrubland habitat in the center of Gran Terre. There's a strong population there, and it's completely different to the dry coastal forest where the crested geckos are found. So it's, yeah, red clay sort of substrate. It looks more like some areas of Australia actually than the tropical forest where you find the crested geckos. So the vegetation, there is a few trees interspersed amongst the scrub, but would be probably not even as high as you would typically find a crested gecko, you know, maybe 9-10 foot. And yeah, the gargoyle geckos are also a lot more terrestrial. So there was points when we were obviously visiting national parks and you'd see drawings of gargoyle geckos and obviously as soon as you see a gecko, I'm like, right, let's need to investigate. And it's because, and they're always drawn on the ground. Like people see them on the floor, and then I'm naturalist, you go on there and you see most of the observations of geckos that are crossing the road. They stand at night, that you've got a bit of eye shine from a gargoyle gecko, and you just couldn't imagine a crested gecko doing that. They're not going to be coming down to the ground. They're certainly not going to be crossing roads. If they do come down to the ground, it would be very rarely. Whereas gargoyle geckos, they live in this sort of short shrub, very sort of thin branches. They sort of work, and they're in the same sort of, is it the same family as the spiny tail geckos? Some of the interesting stuff from Australia. They gargoyles maneuver their environment. They maneuver around sort of thinner shrubland, bushes and stuff, where cresties will be right up in the canopy and understory layers. So very different, and it's hard to really explain it. That's why I've got the photographs. I think they do a better job. I think if anyone wants to know a little bit more about it, we've done a few reels on Instagram, and there's a nice comparison there. So they're completely different habitats. I'm sure there'll be parts within the gargoyle gecko's range, perhaps the more coastal areas, perhaps the lower elevations of the national parks in the centre of Grand Terre, that look a little bit more tropical, that probably look a little bit more like the crested gecko habitat. But overall, where most of the studying has been done, that habitat, that Mackay scrubland that is part of Blue River Provincial Park and all through the centre of the southern half of Grand Terre, is completely different habitat altogether.
That's very. So not that I don't care about New Caledonia. Obviously, love New Caledonian species. But if none of our guests or anyone watching has any more questions about New Caledonia, I'd being that you had mentioned they were related to some of the Australian spiny tail species, I'd love to maybe switch over to some of your observations with some of those things, if you don't mind.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so the last trip the last time I was in Australia, we found four species of Strophosaurus. We were going up the west coast of Australia. Managed to make it up to find a couple of examples of Ciliaris. Pretty happy with that photo. And then we found the Exmouth species, the western species. The scientific names have just gone from my brain all of a sudden, but those spiny tail geckos are just awesome. I think of all the reptiles that I think would make an excellent candidate for a pet and something that I would like to keep, I'd love to keep spiny tails. I know there's obviously always going to be some controversy with keeping sort of newly emerging species that are coming from Australia, because there's no legal methods of doing that, but some of the species of spiny tail have been bred for generations, and they're well established in captivity, and they're just awesome. And those northern spiny tails, they're obviously the biggest ones, really impressive animals. The ones that we were finding were different to the sort of ones that are in the trade. I guess they're probably coming from a locality up north near like Darwin and that kind of thing, or certainly the examples of northern spiny tail geckos that I've seen in the trade are all like, browns and oranges and that kind of thing. Whereas further west, they sort of turn into it's like almost like a silver gecko. They're absolutely stunning.
Is that like the subspecies, like the aberrants?
No, I think it's still Ciliaris, and just across, it's just a really variable gecko. But I'd imagine there could even be more sort of subspecies and species to be described. Because there's heaps of them already. So they're just really, really cool geckos. Yeah,
Jason's a Strophosaurus fanatic.
Oh
I have Ciliaris, I have Intermedius. I'm actually about to get Spinageris in
nice, yeah. Because there's a few. So is there multiple species of Ciliaris then?
Yeah, so you have for like Ciliaris, you do have a subspecies called Ciliaris aberrans.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why I was asking. Maybe it might have been something like that. I know there's only like one person out here in the U.S. that actually has them, so
Right.
we don't. That's probably one we won't really see too much in this hobby, just because just CITES and all that good stuff.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I do know there's like Tenakata. I know there's 3 subspecies of that as well.
Yeah,
and they all have like different eye coloration, and I don't think the tail's any different, but I just know mainly the eyes. There's like silver, there's yellow, and I believe orange or red. One of the two.
Yeah.
So when you saw them out there, when you saw them out there, what during the daytime? Did you see them during the daytime, or was it at night when you were looking?
It was at night, mostly road cruising as well. So yeah, we also found Strophoros elderi, which was really cool.
Oh, nice.
Wasn't expecting to find that species actually, so that was nice.
And were they mostly on the ground crawling around, or were you finding them in like spinifex and other little taller trees?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, we were sort of road cruising, so we were finding them as they were crossing the road. But they were reasonably common, and on the ground, you probably for every 5 fat tails or knobtail geckos, you might get a Strophoros. Like they're reasonably abundant, and you see them sort of moving between spinifex grasses and stuff just across the road in quite barren landscapes as well. So I think it's Spinaceris. We were finding in Shark Bay. So that area is it's basically sand dunes, red sand dunes and spinifex right up to the coast. It's excellent for Woma, but that part of Australia, it's interesting. You've got this divide of like all the way up the west coast. You'll have sand dunes where you've got the Woma pythons, and then you can literally walk 100 meters and you're into rocky terrain. You've got black-headed pythons and things like that, and that's like quite interesting to see. So even in the really sandy stuff where it's just, we were looking for thorny devils in that environment actually, so you don't really find much else, and we were still finding Strophoros. And then the elderi was that was a bit further north in the Pilbara area where it was a little bit rockier. That was crossing into a rocky outcrop. So I know I was reading a paper that says there's sort of 2 clades within Strophoros, that one's more adapted to a sort of arboreal as in navigating sort of, there's a word for it, basically adapted to climbing through grasses, and then another clade that's like more terrestrial, and there's something to do with the hand shape and stuff. So it will be interesting to know what's what there, but again, it's really hard to see them doing their natural thing, because short of actually getting on your hands and knees and going through spinifex for miles and miles, you're probably not going to find them. But they are well adapted to quite surprisingly barren landscapes. And further north, like the Ciliaris was a bit more in like rockier areas, but as soon as you start getting up into that sort of tropical part of Australia, the landscape changes a little bit anyway. But
what kind of temperature readings were you getting in, like, and also like during the daytime, what kind of UV index were you seeing on those?
Yeah, I wasn't actually taking quite as robust measurements as I was doing, obviously, in New Caledonia, where there's a bit more focus. So, but there was one time I measured the sand in this area. There was a Varanus gouldi, like Gould's sand monitor, digging up what I imagine would have been probably like a nest or something inside the road. And we also, like, maybe 5 minutes later, found a western brown snake crossing the road. And this was like, maybe would have still been quite early, maybe like 10 o'clock in the morning. And the sand was 62 degrees Celsius surface temperature. And it was crazy. And there's obviously that, the monitors, it was probably digging to escape some of that heat. But it's active, you've got brown snakes whipping around at that kind of temperature. It's insane. Like, there's some really harsh sort of like temperatures out there. But then also we with like a thunderstorm, further up north in the Pilbara. So you've got humidity. Some of the nights you're looking at sort of 80-90% humidity. But then by the day, as soon as the sun comes up, the cloud's clear, it's like, bounces around a lot, but pretty hot the whole time. I mean, this was like Western Australia in January, which is their peak summer. It was, mostly, I think it would have been in excess of 40 degrees pretty much all the time. Probably drops a little bit lower at night.
Cool.
So out of all your observations, and I know you just had, minor brief encounters with them, is there anything that you observed with, knobtails or Strophaurus that could maybe help guys keeping them in captivity?
Something that I hadn't prepared for there. I probably should have put some more thought into that one.
Figured out.
I mean, they're.
I don't keep either of them, so I really don't know. But I know that they're both taking off in popularity in captivity, and it'd be super cool. Anything really would, any insight into those species would, just be interesting to hear. But I understand 100%.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to understand, like, the spatial ecology of a species when you're just sort of road cruising. The environments themselves, like kind of rocky and sandy. I think people seem to be doing it really well. They're a terrestrial species that spends most of its time on the ground and obviously in burrows and things like that. I guess one thing that you don't see very often, and perhaps because it might pose a risk, or it's just difficult to do, is actually creating burrows in enclosures. It's much easier to just whack a hide in there. Makes sense. It fills that niche. But I do wonder whether species like, knobtail geckos might benefit from having a super hot sort of surface temperature and actually having somewhere to move away from that and go sort of into a burrow. I know trying to simulate that in a terrarium would be difficult, but as I say, it was super harsh out there. It's really not an amicable sort of environment for anything to be around during the day. And then at night, they're mostly terrestrial. And even from a decor perspective, that it's hard to sort of suggest anything because it's mostly just rocky, sort of clay, sand, substrate, and spinifex grass. So, and they're really terrestrial lizards. So
that's great confirmation for the guys that are like that. We got a buddy that, Phil, that keeps some knobtails, and that's what he does. He uses like a clay base and some fake spinifex, but it's just cool to see that guys are right. iNaturalist is nothing short of amazing what it's done for the hobby. It's guys can just look at an animal's range and pretty much take it from there. Without going there, it might be much nicer to obviously travel, but it's cool. It's cool to see that you're observing what guys are doing. So it's a little, like I said, confirmation to the people that are doing it right. That's cool. Yeah,
and it is. It's like I think there's a disconnect between sort of field herpetology and private herpetoculture, where there's a lot of people that love reptiles in Australia that could very easily go out and take some habitat shots and go, that it's something to provide something really useful to the hobby. But it's just not being done, and it's that communicating it. And even if you're really invested in the hobby, what species are not necessarily priorities, but like you say, things that are becoming more popular recently, and where that value is. For example, like I would love to get out to Pakistan and film some leopard geckos and get some lovely habitat shots and take some readings and that kind of thing, because it's something that's missing. It's not till you are invested in the culture and in sort of herpetoculture generally that you realize that there's gaps in this knowledge. But when you've got somebody that perhaps has always lived in Australia surrounded by the knobtail geckos, they probably don't think, actually somebody might really want to see this, So it's great to have the opportunity to go and do that and fill those gaps, with the EK project, and hopefully we do a lot more of it.
And speaking of, what can you tell us about you in EK? What do you guys have planned? What's your guys' ultimate objective rather with the with what you're doing, your publication, and what do you guys want to do? What's your end game?
Well, I guess, I mean, the project itself was founded with this idea of just improving the welfare of reptiles and amphibians in captivity. That's a pretty straightforward goal. At the time, it was during COVID, so it was actually to try and also raise some money for zoos at the time. But over the years, we've done donations and stuff to different charity projects. The idea is first and foremost, improve captive welfare and inspire people to love reptiles. And then basically any money that's left over, donate it to a good cause. We want to see things, we want to benefit herpetoculture. The idea of having a platform where people and hobbyists that perhaps, feel like perhaps their contribution, they don't know maybe how to articulate their own contribution. They might have been working with a really unique species for 50 years and never put pen to paper and things like that. And that there needs to be a platform there. Social media is excellent and it pulls people into groups and networks and communities that basically filled that gap of forums from back in the day, and it's obviously very, very helpful. But to have a professional project that obviously I put my heart and soul into, and try and get it out there to as many people as possible and provide that voice for dedicated people that are not academics. Like I didn't study biology. My sort of career was always in media. I loved reptiles and I loved traveling, and started blogging about reptiles whilst I was living in Australia years ago, and married it all up. But it's then when I see why some hobbyists sometimes think, oh well, why should I write this down? Why, this is for me. This is what I enjoy, and my friends enjoy it too, and I'm connected to it. But perhaps feel like they can't contribute, and so it's nice to have that platform. And obviously, we want to mainly we want to go international this year. We're working on ways to do it, to have them physical copies around the world. They're just nice to have. They are. It's good to get, like when you get a magazine through your door. I might be a little bit biased, but I just think it's fantastic. Like you can, something to actually sit there and enjoy and flick through. And so we want to try and get that as international as possible. Probably start with the US, maybe a European country, hopefully before the end of the year. But then, provide a platform, an educational resource for everybody to engage with. So the social media side of things, as I say, it's kind of new to me. It's only really been this year that I've really tried to find that niche and tried to learn what works with socials. But having that excellent feedback that we've had in the last few months has been fantastic. Even opening new avenues for new keepers. I never thought I'd be on TikTok, to be totally honest, but I'm creating stuff that hopefully there's a generation of people going, and now I know how to, or I've got a little bit of inspiration for how I can do something for my animals, it's growth really, and try and get that word out, have improve the lives of captive animals. And also it's just awesome to highlight some of the work that conservationists and zoologists are doing as well, because reptiles and amphibians, they're obviously quite a sort of maligned group from a conservation perspective, and it's you've already got an audience of people that love reptiles because they keep one at home. So trying to tell them a story about some brown frog in the middle of the Amazon that nobody seems to care about, you've already got the right audience there. So it's nice to be able to work with people that pour their heart and soul out into conservation, that are the biologists and stuff that have maybe spent 10 years on a single project, and get that out to an audience that perhaps they wouldn't have got that media outreach in the first place. So I've sort of gone around a little bit with that question, but growth. And
I love what you're doing. I mean, for any of our guests out there that don't know, they offer a free version, if you sign up for EK Magazine, I mean, I do and have been. I mean, and it's awesome. It's great information. They share a lot of their travels and findings and little tidbits of everything that's helpful if you're in the hobby. I mean, you should check it out. Subscribe to their e-web version, I guess you would call it, of the magazine. I mean, it's great what they do, what you guys do for the hobby in general, man. I think it's amazing. I rave about it all the time. I'm always
thank you
about it. It's I see the potential. I see the future for you guys. I mean, it's it's serious, man. You guys are onto something serious with the traveling and the documentation and the observed, observations and you guys are really different. It's not just like your regular old reptile magazine. This is what animals are doing in the wild and what people can do to, contribute. And I mean, it's an awesome thing that you're doing, man. And you will find keep your foot on the gas. It's
definitely.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Did you run in in your Southeast Asia expeditions? Did you run into any Cerdodactylus while you were out there?
Any what? Sorry.
Cerdodactylus. Did you run into any of the Cerdodactylus species?
Oh yeah, yeah. So there was a species in Borneo.
Forest, right? Forest.
Yeah, it would have been one of the bent-toed geckos, one of the massive ones.
Yeah.
So saw that species. There was also the termite geckos in Sri Lanka as well. So in northern India. So actually, I had a spot for leopard geckos. So actually, I'd gone to meet a friend of mine who's a professor of herpetology at the University of New Delhi, and he said, "Yeah, we've got we'll go out looking for some reptiles." He was like, so I timed it to be there for this first week. He said every year, did his PhD every year. It was that 1 week where he did all of his research year on year, because that was the first week of the monsoons. Everything's out. So I was like, right, perfect. It was like, yeah, we've got Ubifaris here. We've got there was Russell's vipers and crates and all sorts of stuff. But I was like, right, perfect. Get there, and then it was already stressful enough. We had a few sort of issues with accommodation and stuff when we first got to Delhi, and then went out, and it was like during this heat wave that they've had. So it was like 50 degrees heat. The monsoons had all been pushed back. So the pre-monsoons hadn't even started at this point. It was bone dry. And the only thing we found was Cerdodactylus, but it was, I don't know, they call them termite geckos, but a very small little thing. I mean, at least the bent-toed geckos were pretty impressive. I was really cool. But yeah, this one was a tiny little brown gecko. And so, yeah, a bit of a sore point for me, actually. Sorry.
I said that might have been with the Cerdodactylus nebulosus, the clouded Indian gecko. Because they're only like this big.
Oh yeah, no, it wasn't that. Yeah, I don't think it was that pretty, to be honest. I know which one you're on about. But yeah, it was another one. I think I'm sure the hill geckos, termite gecko, something like that.
Okay, I think I know what you're talking about though. Yeah, I've seen the video of Wally. So what was that habitat looking like? For people that are keeping Cerdodactylus, what kind of things should we be trying to replicate in our tanks or whatever else, PVC and stuff?
Yeah, I suppose it's hard to tell. Like that genus is so massive that it would be very difficult to kind of say.
Yeah,
exactly. I mean, the bent-toed geckos. It was interesting. The guy that basically he has a lodge and it used to be an old adventure camp actually in Borneo, but he turned it into an excellent herping location. It's quite famous for herpers, Lupamassa. It's sits at the bottom of, or in the foothills of Mount Kinabalu, and yeah, he'd been there for years, and he said, "Oh yeah, you'll almost definitely see this Cerdodactylus." I want to say it was Peter's bento gecko. I don't know though.
The Peter Slender, is it like the Peter Slender bento gecko?
Yeah, possibly. It was like black with like very thin white banding and like huge. Like it was, yeah.
It might be Pachillus.
Could be. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I know they're one of the bigger ones, like them and the Eriginosus, the giant night stalker gecko.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it could have been
those
that.
are two of the bigger ones.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it was huge. It was a lot bigger than I was expecting, anyway. And yeah, apparently, they're really what's the word? Not territorial, but they have their own sort of. I've completely gone blank. My mind's gone blank.
Happens 15 minutes.
Yeah. Like where they have their own sort of patch, so they stay pretty local. Yeah. Very localized. So this one gecko lived on the bottom of this tree trunk. No, there was a pair of them actually. There was two at the bottom of this tree trunk, like just a fallen down tree, and every night, without fail, comes out, hunts around there, hides in the decaying wood, and almost like very static, which it's lovely to see when you see, like, from a spatial ecology perspective, that an animal doesn't seemingly move that far, because you think, well, what an excellent candidate for captivity. It's almost like the pit vipers. You can have pit vipers will sit in ambush for months at a time and potentially, move from canopy during the dry season to further down in the wet season, but essentially stay in a very small area. They're almost like perfect. If they weren't so spicy, they'd be perfect candidates for captivity. But it was interesting to see that this particular species of Certodactylus was, it stayed pretty local to its own sort of turf, and there was two in the same area, which I don't know whether that was by chance, but they seem to, have their preferences, and they seem to stay there pretty close. For this guy that was running the place said it was there for years, and to be fair, even the smaller Certodactylus, the termite geckos and stuff, like, they are localized around termite hills, and I don't know much about them to be able to say that they spend a lot of time there. But that was an interesting observation, actually. It was just a giant sort of fallen down tree, sort of rotting, and that was home for years for this gecko. So unlike the knobtail geckos, which I think naturally have to move quite far to look for prey in quite a desolate, barren landscape, the Certodactylus would, found their patch in this rotten log, and that's it. The insects come to them. So that was cool.
It's very cool. That's an amazing observation. Again, amazing candidate for captivity. If an animal can stay in a small range like that, I mean, that would probably make people feel, better about keeping. We have a friend, Phil, who was telling us about some knobtail species, and some biologist somewhere put a microchip on this gecko and tracked them over nighttime, and said that they traveled, what, Jay, like 100 yards or a mile or something like that overnight?
Yeah, I think it was a few hundred yards a night.
Which is, to me, is crazy. Nobody's going to give their little knobtail a 200-yard enclosure, but to know that they travel that much is like, they move, versus a species like this that stays on a tree for years is it's just a great observation. These are things that you would never get from captivity without having someone like you out there looking and watching. I mean, this is what this is all about, man. Getting these pieces of information and observations to the people, man, and that's
and it's the guy's been sitting on that information like for years. It was like an adventure camp, and the kids would see the gecko, and like the people knew that the gecko was there. Like, but it wasn't until Herpers started turning up and going, "Wow, that's actually a really cool species. We would love to see that species." And he's gone, and then that information sort of reaches the masses and goes further out, and then you can start making adjustments to your captive care. It's just tapping into those resources that people think when they don't even know that they're resources,
bridging the gaps. That's what technology is best at, if you ask me, bridging the gaps.
So let me ask you, the company that you're working with for the gecko diet, right? So what kind of information did you take from New Caledonia and go put into this product? Like, what kind of data were you getting from that to get this stuff out?
Yeah, so obviously a lot of it's sort of under wraps, I guess, but also, working with them, working with them to obviously, all the information that that's come through EK, and we have obviously published it in EK. There's an article there as well, but they've also got all these habitat shots and stuff, and there's a few sort of interesting product development things that we'd like to do, and also just focus more on like naturalistic things. And the problem is obviously trying to source the exact fruits and the exact sort of materials and stuff from New Caledonia isn't easy. So we're already looking at, potentially if they were to fund another trip, obviously speaking to some environmental agencies out there and prepping the groundwork to actually really run with some of the ideas that we've already had, or the information that I've really passed on to them. So the Blue River Diets will become, or the idea is that it will become a hub of information for keepers, for new keepers, and anyone really, to actually just go straight to the website and see these habitat shots hosted there. We're actually working on a documentary. Blue River Diets obviously funded it, so that's what wants to be, they're the ones that really want to be pushing it. But obviously the EK platform is just perfect to do it on. So like from a product development side of things, I'm not sure how much I can really talk about for that brand, but all the information was there to be passed on to them. They've obviously got all the data from the environmental stuff. I posted averages in the article on EK, so people can see the average temperatures and humidities and that kind of thing, because it looks a bit nicer on a line graph. They've obviously got all of that environmental data. In terms of habitat shots as well, we'll be going through and working with, like, I've used plant identification apps and things like that, and they've given me a pretty good idea for what was growing out there. But obviously they've got the opportunity to then go through it in a little bit more depth and see whether that can then tailor some of the ingredients and things like that. So I know Blue River Diets has the most fruit content of any crested gecko diets, I think, and low fat as well. And obviously even looking at the body condition of some of these geckos that we were finding on the expedition, you can start making a better judgment for what that kind of crested gecko diet looks like. Like, should it have artificial ingredients to make it particularly appealing to people, when actually it should be lower fat? And you can start making that's for them to sort of work with, really. But it was really just to try and get that in situ information and just pass it on to them.
Okay. And you said it's already released in over the UK or no?
Yeah, so it's already out in the UK.
What kind of flavors are they offering?
So the really popular one, which I thought was a fantastic idea, is the fruit and bug. So that's I think selling extremely well, because it's actually made from black soldier fly larvae. So that's the protein component of it, is actually insects themselves. There's like calci worms. I don't know the process that goes into them. I think they're dried, but that's quite a big ingredient for even things like fish food. So another brand that works with EK is Fish Science, and fish food, for example, is mostly fish meal to add the protein element, and now that's obviously a lot more naturalistic with insect meal. And in these crested gecko diets, you're using actual live foods, not live, but once live foods in the actual diet itself. And in New Caledonia, you've not got this huge abundance of fruit absolutely everywhere. So those sort of components of high protein, low sugar, low fat, but obviously like high fruit content is really interesting. And I think that's quite a unique thing. They've also got it's 5 other flavors. It's pineapple crush, strawberry burst. There's a mango madness, I think. But most recently, they've also launched dragon fruit flavor as well, which is it's really cool. The packaging's awesome. Like, it's just a really, really nice product. So there's a few different flavors there. There's no, it's not like we've instantly developed this brand new formula from New Caledonia ingredients, albeit I don't know how much I should say, but there's new formulas in the works that are a bit more in tune with exactly what New Caledonia is all about and the Isle of Pines itself, and it will be exciting. So people just really need to keep up with Blue River, and also their socials. They've got all of the content from that expedition, so EK's publishing bits and trying to get that information out, but anyone that's keeping Cresties or who just wants to contextualize a bit of their knowledge, like, you can follow them on socials. The website has got a fair bit of information, but it's really that social media that's just adds extra content and talked about some of the more like interesting sort of facts and stuff like that as well. So definitely, if you're a Cresty keeper, give them a follow. This is the dragon fruit flavor one. It's a full trailer announcement, but it's a cool product.
Is there anything that maybe they're working on, or that you can share with us, with them doing anything species specific? Like some companies make a Chihuahua specific diet or a Leachianus specific diet. Do you know, or is there anything you can tell us about Blue River maybe coming out with something for gargoyles in particular?
I don't.
Geckos?
I don't think. So that there's potentially a new range coming out soon, targeted at a group of geckos, I guess, but nothing that's like specific to Chihuahua or Leachies, as far as I'm aware. If we were to go and do another expedition and try and focus more on particular species, perhaps there could be a really interesting product there. But I think for now, it's a new brand. It's something that they need to get out there and highlight just the benefits of the brand itself. It's completely natural. It's high fruit content. As I say, they've swapped some components. So, I know a lot of diets have things like, potato starch and stuff like that. And I think they use like a coconut formula. So it's a bit more like natural. It lowers that sort of fat content. There's a lot of really interesting things going on with the brand. And I'm sure it will be a huge success when it reaches the US as well. It's already gone down really well in the UK. Obviously, by comparison, it's a very small market. I think there's a European launch lined up soon. There's a lot happening very quickly over the next couple of months from Blue River's perspective, with the US and Europe. And I'm sure, if this is obviously going out live, isn't it? So I don't think the launch has happened in either place yet, but it will be imminent. So, yeah.
Awesome. Well, I wish you guys nothing but the best of luck, man. I mean, I feel that the more options people have, the better it is for the hobby in general. I mean, it's great that someone's trying to better what already exists. There's nothing wrong with that at all.
Yeah. So it's definitely an interesting product,
So I know I got one more question. So, actually, kind of a two-parter. So now, so that you're doing all this travel now, do you keep any reptiles currently?
So I keep some Dendrobates tinctorius, the blue Azaraeus. So a few frogs, and that's about it really. It's just enough that family can look after while I'm away.
Gotcha.
So for the next little while, I'm basically in the process of getting a flat. That's why I'm actually at a hotel right now. So I'll be settling down for a little while. So the next year might be a little bit more, definitely UK based, but I'd like to increase my collection, but obviously travel is such an important thing for me that there's always likely to be a point when I go, right, okay, I'm in a bit of a pinch here, and having a large collection will be difficult. And also where we're looking at living is quite far away from family, so it's not as easy as having a family member pop round and look after them for a week. So I don't know. I'd like to see it. The thing is, if I do increase my collection or start a collection properly, it'll all be on socials as well. I won't stop talking about it, so I'm sure you'll be able to keep up with it.
Oh yeah. So so from you going over to New Cal and stuff, or just everywhere in general, right? How has it kind of changed your keeping with just your dart frogs?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because you get a lot of observations just traveling and doing field herping anyway, and things like with the Cetodactylus, like you learn that certain species have certain tendencies for different things. I've been quite lucky to see a few different poison frogs in the wild, and a few of the thumbnail ones down in Ecuador, and a few of the larger species in sort of Central America. And even that in itself is quite interesting because you realize the variation with different species. So there is like a typical dart frog enclosure, that people go for because they look fantastic. Having some lovely bromeliads in there is really nice. You can make a beautiful display with dart frogs, but there's when you see the differences between the different species. So, like for example, Dendrobates auratus, you find them in Costa Rica. Just found them just jumping around hotel complexes, like short grass lawns and things like that around. If there's a bit of leaf litter gathered in a corner, you find them bouncing around everywhere. And then you've got things like, for example, Ranitimea down in South America that have like a preference for, instead of, you do find them in bromeliads. So I always think it's a good idea to just have bromeliads, but people seem to assume that you need bromeliads to keep all poison dart frogs. I'm sure there's some that you obviously benefit from, and from a breeding perspective, it's nice to have them in there, and obviously it increases humidity and stuff. But a lot of species, like the auratus, for example, will happily hop around, probably never go near an actual bromeliad. And then you've got the Ranitimea. You can find, I think it's called like a pine cone flower, but they're quite common down in South America. They sort of looks like honeycomb, and they're quite waxy. It's actually the water in them creates like, I think it's like an antiseptic thing. It's like a sort of traditional medicine. But you find the tiny little Ranitimea in there. So guides will walk around and go, "Oh, you want to see one of these? Yeah, squeeze the plants," and they'll just jump out of there. Whereas you kind of have this idea of, and there was also some that I found where they've been so small that they will just sit on a leaf, and if a leaf catches a little bit of water, that's all it needs. It doesn't need a big axil, a big bromeliad axil. They will just sit in folds on leaves and things like that. And you start to realize actually these animals are like quite versatile with their own behaviors, and we have this idea we've fallen. It's not really a trap because bromeliads are great; they work excellently for poison frog setups. But where you think, oh, it needs to look like this, and actually in the wild, it really doesn't. And I would love to go out and see the Tinctorius, especially the Azorius population, because I think they live almost in savanna. Like they live in a tiny pocket of forest surrounded by savanna landscape. Like that would be completely different to how most people would keep them at home. So I've always been like, with my personal keeping, I try to create or created a nice enclosure that has a bit of a slope to try and make the most of the sort of land area. I've got some bromeliads in there because they just look awesome, but give them plenty of space. Try and structure the lighting so that there's some of it's broken up with plants, but there's also like an open area for them to sort of jump around, because they're really bold sort of diurnal frogs that they're everywhere, they're bouncing around all over the place. So they need that space, whereas I think it's very easy to like densely plant an enclosure, and in actual fact that's probably not what the frog really needs. Also, using hides, I always like to use naturalistic looking stuff, so finding some really cool cork bark tubes with like holes in them, to use them as hides rather than sort of the coconut husks. And it's down to a completely personal preference, but in the wild, you'll find all these layers and as well leaf litter is one thing why people seem to opt towards you know, a beautiful mossy enclosure because it looks really nice, but actually these frogs are living in, you know, inches and potentially meters of leaf litter. You know, like there's layers and layers of leaf litter. They probably never touch the ground. There's that much leaf litter becomes the ground. You know, but people don't want to do that with their enclosures. They don't want to just absolutely fill it with leaf litter. And I get it. I do get it. But yeah, I tend to say like bury some cork bark tubes so they're sort of like partly submerged in the substrate. Put a load of leaf litter over it, put another cork bark tube, and like just create an environment where, because they'll find their own hides, you know, they'll find the right place for them. Whereas, yeah, it's very, you know, you can look at a terrarium and go, right, I'm going to build the perfect home for my animal. In actual fact, trying to create a slice of the wild, and also obviously as long as you're getting all your lighting and your heating and the environment stuff done correctly, it's just as beneficial for them. And you can change that up and mix it up over time and keep them stimulated. You know, you don't have to have your animal's house. You know, you can create a slice of the wild and watch those natural behaviors. I think we complicate things in the hobby very often, and we also oversimplify. So when you look at nature and you can try and get some idea of what these animals are doing, it makes it easier to at least create something for them, you know.
Oh yeah. So definitely.
All right. Well, I got one more question for you, and it's pretty ambiguous, I guess. It's up to your interpretation. Dream destination, dream species to observe. Maybe you've been there. Maybe you'd go back. If you could go somewhere, anywhere in the world, funds weren't an option. What region, what species, where would you go?
I'm gonna sound like a right idiot, because actually a lot of species that are like iconic ones I have been very fortunate to see. So like I would go back to the Galapagos in a heartbeat. Like that probably the best place I think I've ever been in. Just yeah. Like I don't flinch when people ask me, you know, where's the best place to be? Like Galapagos, hands down, it's awesome. So yeah, if money wasn't an issue, I'd go straight back there again.
Darwin wasn't for nothing, you know.
Sorry,
Darwin wasn't obsessed for nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it made me want to sit and write myself into oblivion. You know? Publish a load of works and stuff. It's inspirational. It was just an awesome place. I guess there was less like craft breweries when he was over there, to be honest. But I mean, it only adds to the charm. So,
right.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Thomas, I don't know. Where can everybody find you at, man?
Yeah, so you can follow EK on @ExoticsKeeper on Instagram. We are on YouTube. We haven't updated YouTube for a while, but yeah, Instagram's the best place at the minute. Also Facebook, ExoticsKeeper. You can follow me as well. So I also have tommarriott.wildlife. It's just a personal account. I post some of my photography on there. Trying to get that sort of jumping, I guess. And then if anyone has any sort of pitches for ideas, you've been working with a species for a long time, you know, you're dedicated to a particular species or project, or you've been herping, you saw something really cool out in the wild, you've got a cache of, you know, photographs of something that you know, if you've got something that you need, that you want to tell, and you feel like you can benefit the community and herpetoculture generally, then drop me a line, message, email, anything, and we'll have a conversation with, whether that's an interview, whether it's publishing something that you've done. And encourage anyone to reach out to us.
Very cool.
Well, it was definitely a pleasure to have you on, man.
Thank you so much.
You know,
very
New Caledonia, insights to Southeast Asia, Australia. You know, I was like, I've been to a few of these places, but I've never really done the insights like you've done, and it's completely like blown my mind on hearing some of this stuff. So
awesome, thank you. It's been great to talk to you guys, and thank you for having me on the podcast.
No problem, man. Definitely. Well, have a great night. Okay.
so much.
Yeah, you too. All right, take care. All the best.